Welcome everyone to the Eugene City Council work session for November 28th. Back from Thanksgiving. Everybody had a good Thanksgiving. And we're going to try to finish up our work on this portion of Envision Eugene tonight.
I'll turn it over to Robin. We did a little bit of introduction last time, so Robin, you can do your thing.
Take it away. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good evening, Mayor and City Council. I'm Robin Hostick with the City of Eugene Planning Division. This is a continuation of our presentation update on Envision Eugene from last week. This is the second portion of that, where I will be walking you through an update on our multifamily housing need as well as our commercial need. Just as a little kind of a framing for this, it's been a while since we've talked about these two components of Envision Eugene. So what we're going to do is just kind of step slowly through some numbers and also touch base just briefly on our pillars as just a little bit of framing for you. So one of the pillars of Envision Eugene of the draft proposal talks specifically about compact urban development. And it really clearly highlights this community goal of meeting all of our multifamily housing needs and our commercial needs excuse me, within the urban growth boundary over the next 20 years. And it goes on to say that the way that we're going to accomplish that is by really trying to focus development, and in particular redevelopment, on what we're calling our key transit corridors and core commercial areas. This diagram is probably pretty familiar to you by now. Just for anybody watching, the yellowish areas along the main streets leading in and out of town, those are our key transit corridors, and the dark red shapes, those are our core commercial areas. We're going to be using the same format of diagram that we've used when we've talked about single-family housing. We'll do the same for commercial. And essentially, what we'll do is just walk step by step through each one of these boxes, starting with the bottom row, and starting with the left on vacant land. So our vacant land, essentially, like all the other categories, is land that has no development on it whatsoever, so we can consider that all full capacity for new development. When we do have a scattering of multifamily, of course, the first subject here is our multifamily housing need and capacity. So we have a scattering of vacant multifamily lands across the city, and if we add up the acreage on those various lands and consider our density assumptions ongoing over the next 20 years, we're looking at a capacity of around 3,350 units for that category. Moving on to partially vacant land, these are lands that have some amount of development on them but may have some additional capacity on that same tax lot. And the analysis for partially vacant land was fairly extensive. We actually went through and looked at each one of these developed parcels one by one to see if there was any potential there for additional development. These are two good examples. So the way that we count that is we remove the portion of the property that's already developed and consider the rest of it as having capacity. So if we add up the amount of partially vacant land and consider our future density assumptions, we look at about 2,560 units of capacity for that category. Moving right along to redesignation, we want to talk about this just for a moment here. This is a diagram that I believe you all saw at your November 9th meeting where we talked about single-family housing. And in the context of that conversation, these areas that are circled here in North Eugene and also over there in West Eugene are areas that are currently designated for multifamily that we were talking about potentially redesignating for single-family use. Now, what that would do, of course, is increase our capacity for single-family housing, but obviously the same action is going to reduce our capacity for multifamily housing. So in this category of redesignation, we're actually looking at a negative number in this category, a potentially negative number. Also, we are continuing to have conversations with the property owners and assess which of these properties make sense to potentially redesignate for single-family use. So we're looking at a range here. So we would reduce our capacity somewhere between 220 to 2,200 units for redesignation. Baseline redevelopment, what we mean by this term baseline redevelopment is basically just the natural rate of redevelopment that we would expect to see over the next 20 years without taking any kind of a special actions. These are some examples here of multifamily redevelopment that's occurred in the past, and fortunately we have tracked this information, so we have pretty good data. And looking back at that data, we can make some assumptions and projections looking forward about what we might see over the next 20 years. It's not a huge amount. We're looking at about 570 units of capacity just through our baseline redevelopment, again, without taking any further actions. Adding up the bottom row, and of course, backing out potential reduction in capacity through redesignation to single family, we would be looking at about somewhere between 4,200 to 6,200 units of multifamily capacity inside the urban growth boundary currently. The next piece that we'll talk about, of course, is our multifamily housing need. And the need, of course, for multifamily has to do a lot with the housing mix, of course, the mix between single-family and multifamily housing. And we just want to acknowledge up front that the council has not made a decision on that yet. So what we're going to do is take a look at a chart to look at the different possibilities and how those different mixes that we've been studying affect our multifamily need. So on the left, you see the 60% single-family, 40% multifamily need. Over on the right, you see the other end of the spectrum that we've been studying, which is the 40% single-family, 60% multifamily mix. And the top row there underneath that, the multifamily need, you can see it's affected quite directly by a change in percentage between single and multifamily. Of course, it increases with a greater proportion of multifamily need. The middle row, the existing capacity, that's the number we just looked at for our capacity inside the UGB. Of course, that remains the same regardless of what our housing mix is for the future. And on the bottom, you can see that our remaining multifamily need, so our total need minus the capacity, also increases as you move towards the greater share of multifamily housing. So just as an example and an illustration back with our diagram, if we were to use a 55-45 mix, we would see a total need for multifamily housing of about 6,300 units. And if you subtract out the existing capacity, the range of existing capacity inside the urban growth boundary, we have in this orange box over here a remaining need of somewhere between 80 and just over 2,000 units. So this number here, this remaining need, is the number that we want to keep in mind as we think about our community's goal of accommodating our multifamily capacity inside the urban growth boundary over the next 20 years. And the chief way that we would have to accommodate that need is to look for ways to increase that baseline redevelopment number that I mentioned before, the box just to the left there, through some kind of actions or interventions that we would take as local government to try to affect the market and get a greater amount of redevelopment and possibly a greater density of redevelopment as well. A lot of these interventions or actions overlap with actions that affect our commercial capacity as well, and also mixed use. So I'll bring those up again at the end of the next diagram. And just as a reminder here, we're shifting gears. We've been talking about our multifamily need. The next step, of course, is to talk about our commercial need. So just a little mental shift here. This is the same diagram, but again, we're talking about commercial employment here. Commercial employment is retail and office jobs. So we distinguish that from our industrial employment. So just a clarification there. The diagram is roughly the same as the one that we just looked at. There are a couple of differences here. There are a couple of different boxes, and I'll explain those as we walk through. Again, we'll start on the bottom left, jobs on existing land. This is a category that's unique to commercial employment, primarily because there are two ways that we can get job capacity in our community without having to build anything and without requiring any new land. One of those ways is through home-based occupations. So we expect that in the future there will be more people engaged in home-based occupations. And of course, as people move into the community, or as the community grows, there will be more of those people as well who are engaged in home-based occupations. The second way, of course, is through empty office space and empty retail space. And given the unemployment rate right now, we would expect, and also just under typical conditions, a fair amount of capacity simply in vacant space. So if you add both of those up, our capacity through jobs on existing land would be around 4,800 jobs total. Moving along to vacant land, again, similar to our single-family and our multifamily housing, these are undeveloped lands. Again, there's a scattering of them across the city. Adding those up and considering our job density assumptions over the next 20 years, we'd be looking at about 3,900 jobs in that category of capacity. Our partially vacant lands for commercial, for this category, we did an assessment very similar to what we did for multifamily housing, and actually went through lot by lot across the city and looked at different commercial properties to see if there's any capacity left. This is a great example here. You can see the western half of this lot is completely undeveloped. There's not a huge amount of commercial capacity in partially vacant lands, but there is some. So we'd be looking at an additional capacity of about 550 jobs for that category. Adding these three categories up, we're looking at an existing capacity of just over 9,200 jobs here, 9,250 jobs inside the urban growth boundary. Our commercial employment need, you may recall last week when Jason talked about our industrial need, looking at a 0.9% growth rate. Now, this is the current Oregon Employment Department forecast for Lane County. There's a new forecast that will be coming out in early 2012, and we expect that to be higher, potentially. But just looking at a snapshot in time until we know what that number is, at the 0.9% growth rate, we would be shooting for a total job need of about 16,000 jobs. Subtracting out the existing capacity inside the urban growth boundary leaves us with a remaining need, of about 6,750 jobs citywide over the next, over the next 20 years. Again, this is the number that we want to look at when we consider meeting all of our commercial capacity inside the urban growth boundary. So that's the target. And the way that we would do that, of course, is through, again, using our lands more efficiently inside the urban growth boundary, baseline redevelopment, as well as any additional redevelopment that we might achieve after that. These two categories we'll go ahead and walk through step by step in just a little bit more detail. Baseline redevelopment, again, is the natural rate of redevelopment that we would expect over the next 20 years without any kind of interventions. These three examples are commercial redevelopment that have happened fairly recently. However, we don't track or have not tracked in the past commercial redevelopment. Therefore, we need a little different kind of a methodology or a different approach to determining what the future redevelopment might look like. And we're currently engaged right now with a subcommittee of the Technical Resource Group to get a better handle on a methodology that we think is going to get us a more accurate result and also assist us with some other estimates for future capacity. And we'll come back to you and talk actually about this and some other things as they unfold a little bit later on. Of course, there are some things that we can do to boost the capacity beyond that baseline. We're calling these interventions. You can also call them tools or actions. Basically, it's just something that we can do, again, as a local government to try to affect the market and boost the amount of redevelopment, as well as potentially the density of redevelopment. And that's not a complete list, and we will be, part of our ongoing work is to take a look at some of these different interventions and assess the potential impact that they would have on our redevelopment rate. I want to touch for a moment on mixed use. These interventions also have the potential to incentivize or create a better environment for creating new mixed use development in the community. Just a note about that, almost all of the mixed use development that's happened in Eugene, the mixed use redevelopment that's happened has been made possible by, in some cases, fairly substantial packages of interventions and actions taken by the community to make that happen. So just something to keep in mind as we look forward. Here's an example of an intervention that has been talked about not only as part of the Envision Eugene pillars, but also a couple of years prior to that as part of the West Eugene Collaborative. And this is to increase flexibility in industrial zones or potentially rezone some of our industrial areas for commercial use in particular, or potentially for mixed use. All the purple areas that are shown on the map are areas that we might look at. This is also part of ongoing work currently where we're starting to focus in on some areas that might make a little more sense for this. So that's just one example. Next steps would be, of course, to complete the estimate of redevelopment capacity for commercial lands, and also, again, to take a look at some of those different interventions and see how much of an impact they might have. And as information becomes available, we'll be putting that up online for our ongoing online open house, as well as our live open house on December 6th. So that's it for the presentation.
Pat, thank you. You want to ask first question, Pat?
Hi. Thanks, Robin. As ever, a great presentation. Just a question on job density assumptions. That term you use, job density assumptions. How do you determine job density? What are the assumptions on job density?
Well, I believe that the density assumptions were determined by looking at across the community what exists currently and actually counting up the number of jobs on certain parcels in like a sampling of different areas around town. And it's divided, it's a different density for for office jobs as it is for retail jobs. So we looked at retail centers, looked at different office centers, and made assumptions based on that.
So it's based on experience then?
Yes, it's based on the local community.
Okay,
yep.
Glad to hear that. Doesn't surprise me. Then the other question is regarding, so the 6,750 jobs is the number we look at when we look at meeting our needs inside the UGB. That's based upon the job density assumptions that you just described.
Correct.
Okay. And the one other question regarding the 0.9 growth rate assumption that's given to us, how realistic is that based upon experience?
Well, it changes depending on what the forecast is. So
It's a snapshot.
I'm sorry?
A snapshot then?
Yes, it is a snapshot. So, did you have something to add, Carolyn?
Well, I do, actually. I've recently seen a chart that showed year by year the state's forecast for job growth and then the actual job growth compared to it. And I would say they track fairly parallel, although it looks like the state maybe is a little optimistic at times.
They wouldn't do that.
But as Robin mentioned, that job forecast of 0.9%, we are expecting a new one to come out within the next month or so, and rumor has it might be higher than 0.9%.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then on commercial, just a quick question regarding the possibility of redesignating or more flexibility in industrial areas.
Yes.
We're talking about adding industrial land in larger parcels. Can we assume then that the flexibility is addressing smaller parcels of the land?
Yes, that's a correct assumption. That's actually a good nuance to point out. The areas that make most sense for redesignation are definitely smaller parcels. They're near larger streets where commercial kinds of use would be more viable.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's a good point.
So I can assume then that it by no means affects the needs that we were talking about the last meeting?
No.
Regarding attracting larger employers and...
No, at this point, the way we're looking at it, any kind of redesignation for commercial use would not increase our industrial employment need.
So we should not assume,
industrial
then,
land
to say that for myself one more time, we shouldn't assume that increasing flexibility in industrial area to allow commercial doesn't mean we have a surplus of industrial area.
No.
I mean, just to be clear, it's not just that they're smaller parcels, it's also multiple owners, which would make it extremely difficult to pull together for a larger industrial parcel need.
Thank you very much. That covers it. Thank you, Mayor.
Director Brown?
Thank you. I'm going to just have a couple questions. Does commercial land include office space and, like professionals and office space? And does it include retail uses too?
Yes,
Both are
yes.
lumped under?
Yeah, and commercial employment need includes both office use and retail use.
Okay. And then in determining the need for more commercial space, have you actually inventoried the vacant office space that exists now? Either square footage or by location, the floors, or...
That's kind of a question for
No, the reason I ask that is
Yeah.
because if we knew how many vacant spaces we have, then we could do the calculation, 0.9% growth, and then we could say, well, we have this many, and according to these formulas, we would therefore need this amount of square footage of new office space.
Yeah, this is
Assuming
something
we
that,
fill all the old ones first.
yeah. I think that,
I know it's a lot of extra work, but it seems like
well, I believe that there is an assessment done for vacant office space, and what we've been talking about doing with our technical resource group is taking a little closer look at that. Again, that's a moving target as well,
Sure.
because it changes all the time.
Yes, flexible.
So, yeah, so
If we could
that
see
again
those
would be a
figures-
snapshot.
If we could see those figures, if you finally assemble them, that would, I think it'd be very helpful.
Okay, thank you.
It would be for me, for sure, and I think the other counselors would appreciate it too. It just helps us get a handle on that. And then Councilor Farr touched on the, so what I believe I heard you say is that if we redesignate some of these industrial parcels to commercial, we're not automatically increasing the industrial quote-unquote need outside the urban growth.
That's correct.
Hear you say that. Okay.
Yes.
And one thing I'd like also is a little bit finer grained map of the commercial employment and the lands that are being considered to be possible redesignation for
That's definitely something.
being redesignated to commercial. I mean, I see these, but these are just kind of like blobs. And,
Yeah, that is definitely
that's
something we come
99,
back
that's West 11, but if we could just have a little finer grained look at that, I'd appreciate that too.
Absolutely. We would definitely come back to you with more detailed information about that.
Great,
Yes.
thank you.
Chris?
Oh, thank you. I'm really pleased with the work you've done so far. I know there's a lot of moving parts to try to bring together, and I know that we're realizing that the clock is ticking, but I'd rather be deliberate than misstep. When you're talking on one of the slides, I think it's about, I don't know which number it is. It's the one that's boosting capacity that has the list of items on it.
Sure.
That one. When I look at that list, one of the things that's intriguing to me is just going down that list, financial incentives such as MUPD, redesignation of industrial lands, high-capacity transit like MX, tax increment financing like downtown development districts, area planning. You're talking about some of the most controversial and difficult conversations that we can have. And that's not to shy away from them, but it's to acknowledge that this won't be an easy process. Because in order to achieve what we want to achieve, we're going to have to do it in ways that's going to make folks uncomfortable, not only in the community, but around this very table. And so I think it will be real critical for us to be clear that the goal is important enough and that the outcome is important enough that we're willing to really have the conversation and try to arrive at the solution that we think is best for the community. Because if you try to deal with an issue just as an isolated issue, you're forgetting it's in the context of a larger discussion. So each one of these items is related to other items, which is related to a larger conversation. So if we want to talk about financial incentives, we're doing it in the context of larger development. If we're talking about multifamily versus single-family, it's in the context of a larger conversation. The same is true with all of these. And I just want us to be aware that none of the conversations we're going to be having on any of these subjects can really be treated as an isolated discussion about an isolated issue. It's how it interconnects with this stuff that then becomes real critical for us to keep our eye on multiple moles popping out of multiple holes as we move along. and that's going to be real interesting because we've certainly tied this into some very difficult subjects. And I, for one, don't want to shy away from it, but I want to go into it very thoughtfully. And the way you can help us best is as we approach each one of these is to have as much knowledge about what are the best practices, what not only works for us, but what are the best practices in other areas. What are they doing and how are they paying off? Is there any sort of a track record around these that we can rely on? If we're inventing this, that's one thing, but if we can benefit from what's been done in other areas, I would love to know how that might help us to make these extremely difficult choices.
Mike, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to take off from where Chris left off there and say I agree with his sentiments, and as I look at this list, a lot of these are incentives that we currently use, and we have oftentimes debates about them at the table. But these are incentives that we've had, many of them, that we've had in place for a while to try to get to the goal of greater density and greater mixed-use center development in our community. Matter of fact, a few years ago, we had the transplant come up with seeing a short of our capacity needs, and the way we dealt with that problem was to say we were going to build several mixed-use centers, and we put some of these incentives in place. And it's my understanding that we created like 6 particular areas where we were going to try to focus on multi-use centers. Do I have that about right? The history of it?
Are you talking about nodal development?
Well, I remember there being a lot more than 6 nodes, but there might have been 6 sort of Uber nodes.
It was my understanding that we had several aspirational areas where we might do that. And even with the incentives that are listed here that we put in place, we got almost none of them. Actually, no one stepped up to do them because they couldn't make money in the process, and it wasn't financially feasible to do them. My point here is that I hope we're going to think outside the box and add more to this in the way of incentives if we hope to see this done. Because it's been, at least my experience watching this, that we haven't been remarkably successful yet at seeing multi-use centers crop up with the field of incentives we have in place right now, and we'll certainly need more. The other thing that I wanted to see to point out was that, again, we went back to the 0.9% job growth issue, and we're again basing our land need, or where we hope to see the vision of our community in the future, and how we'll grow there, based on what the state projects we will do, rather than our own aspirational desires, rather than what we think we need, and rather than what we think we want in the way of a rate of job growth. We're accepting the state's projections of what they think we will probably do as the way we'll plan for the amount of land we'll need. I'd like to challenge us to do better than that. I'd like to challenge us to say, if we really are serious about decreasing unemployment, and if we're serious about what we've put down aspirationally with our regional economic development goals, that we'll not accept the 0.9% number as good enough. Because from my point of view, it's not. We need to do better than that. We need to have job growth at a higher rate than that, at a faster rate in the next 10 years, in order to get back to any semblance of normal. So it's my belief we should be looking at larger numbers in order to get the people in our community back to work. We have to have the capacity. Thank you.
George Foley?
Thank you, Rob. Nice job on the presentation. I have a couple of clarification points. On slide 30, where you have the picture of the Oakway Mall and the new building there on Club in Coburg, and another new building, You describe, what did the word that you used to describe that type of building again? Or development?
Well, we're calling that category of capacity baseline redevelopment. So that's the amount of redevelopment that would naturally occur without any kind of incentives or actions additionally on our part.
That's the part I didn't catch. So basically, these were done through private,
Without our help.
That's correct.
without our help?
That's
Okay.
correct.
All right, good. That's the part that I wanted to despise. And then if you go back also to slides, I think it's 16 and 17, you preface that on slide 15, you had to break down the different graphs with the multifamily need, existing capacity, and remaining multifamily need. And then you did the one with the equation on there. Would it be possible to get that same type of a formatted for all the different combinations of the 60-40, 55-45, 50-50, and 40-60 mix?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
something that is easily readable? Just so we have it, just so I can have it for a reference.
Yeah, just to clarify, are you talking about having this, this matrix here filled out with these values?
Right.
Essentially?
That's
Okay.
it. Yeah,
Sure.
that's the one. Just so I can have it for a reference. I know that the primary discussion is set at a certain percentage point, but I want to be able to compare them all as we continue on with the discussion. Thank you.
Alan?
So, carrying on that theme, so I'm a little stuck on how you actually create the baseline for redevelopment for both commercial and multifamily. Is that basically looking at historic data?
For multifamily, yes, but for commercial, we don't have historic data on commercial redevelopment.
Right.
So that's what we're up to our eyeballs in right now with our technical resource group, is trying to figure out how we're going to assess potential redevelopment in the future. And we're looking at using a market-based approach to that tries to understand property values and also the potential incentive to redevelop a certain property based on a certain kind of development. For example, a low-rise or mid-rise, to see what pencils out. So it's a market-based approach. We're just testing a couple of small areas right now to see.
And apply that to the actual vacant land?
Exactly.
To figure out how much...
Well, to the developed land, since we're talking about redevelopment. Yeah.
Because it's redevelopment, right?
Yeah, so for multifamily, yes, it's looking back, but for commercial, I think the methodology will be interesting. It's also going to provide us a foundation, so in the future, if we look down the road 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and we do start tracking redevelopment for commercial, which we intend to do as part of ongoing monitoring, we can compare that to what our approach predicted. So we'll have a lot better information next time around.
So, back to the tools slide.
Yes.
And for future presentations, it'd be really cool if we could have these numbered and 2 per page. Right, because some of this is hard to read. It gets so small. Yeah, I can see it. It's just
31.
not really in great
Do
detail.
this, Alan, it'll make it bigger.
Yeah. My eye paper's broken. Eye paper. So I agree with what Mike was talking about. These are the tools, and this is, I've been thinking about this in terms of envisioning you being phase 1, phase 2. Phase 1 setting the urban growth boundary, and phase 2 kind of talking about the tools and the policies and the interventions, the things that incentives we're going to do to actually meet the aggressive goals that we set within phase 1. And but this one kind of overlaps. This is, you have to kind of figure some of this out in order to come up with the number to figure out how much need we have. And I'm kind of wondering how you're approaching that.
Well, the first step is to try to understand how much commercial redevelopment we would get if all else being, if we didn't do any of these necessarily moving forward. And then, as someone mentioned earlier, you can actually look at other communities and get some sense if there are studies for a particular incentive that you're looking at or a particular intervention that you're looking at. Other communities may have tried that in the past, and there may be published information about what kind of a bump in redevelopment they received as a result. So looking at different studies, you might be able to make some estimate about the boost either in pricing or some other factor of redevelopment that one of these interventions would affect. So that's a whole discussion in itself, and something that hopefully we're going to be able to tackle piece by piece with the technical resource group coming up here. But the first step, of course, would be to understand the baseline and then to understand the boost that you would get for each one of these or a combination of these.
I think also, we talk about the seventh pillar has to be a part of this conversation because I don't think we're going to know in detail about every possible scenario that's going to play out in 20 years. We can't know that. And so the seventh pillar becomes an important part of the whole package that says, as we go ahead and implement some things, if it's working the way we assumed it to be working, great. If not, this is sort of your jaws of uncertainty, then we need to be willing to come back, reassess, reevaluate, and then move forward based on that new information.
Right.
Whether it's this or any of the other pieces of it,
Right.
I think it's a critical part.
So is the general direction to staff that to be conservative, moderate, or aggressive in this type of analysis?
My guidance has been, and we talked about it here, is to be aggressive but reasonable. And so I do think we need to continue to do that. But the reasonable part also says that it has to be realistic and doable.
Right.
And we have to have some level of commitment that we are going to be working on towards some of these kinds of things, or we shouldn't even include them as part of that.
Right. And then we'll get more of that in phase 2 when we start talking about tools and policies.
Yeah, some of this, I think, will continue to play itself out
Should.
over the years.
Yeah,
as we continue through this process.
yeah, well, potentially forever.
Yeah. And new ideas and all of those things.
Yeah. I like the aggressive yet reasonable, or about reasonable. That sounds like a good standard to use. Carolyn, you mentioned a new potential growth estimate. And we will use that new one?
Well,
Or will that wreak havoc on everything we've done so far?
there will be, we'll have an option. There's a state safe harbor, which says that if you use our existing forecast, then you are safe from, that would withstand an appeal.
Right.
That's
what this .9
So
is.
that's what .9 is. When
Right.
it changes in January or whenever it changes, then that will become the new safe harbor. There's another option, though, and that is that we've come up with our own growth forecast based on local conditions. It's just not a safe harbor. So we're using .9 just as an example to give us a snapshot if we were to use that, what our current gap would be. But the council, it will be the council's decision about what they choose to go with, the safe harbor or a different one.
Right. The timing of that's going to be odd because we're going to be coming back with a recommendation in January, so it'll probably be based on .9 because we won't have that yet, and then we can move forward, which could potentially change all of that. And so like a .1 change, what kind of, do you have a sense of what that does in terms of need for commercial and residential land?
I don't think we've run that yet, but this is certainly a moving target that we are trying to zero in on.
Right, yeah, right, exactly. Okay, that's all I have, thanks.
So it's
Good job,
always
Ellen.
going to be seems like it's always going to be a moving target in some ways. I guess the part that I think besides the pillars that we need to be pulling back to all the time is at some point it's your policies that are going to drive where we go, and that's aside from the other discussions we've been having. They've been giving us a lot of information based on what they're required to give us, but it is the policies that are really going to drive where we're actually going to go, and that's what Mike's bringing up and others are bringing up. So it seems to me that, I don't know in terms of multifamily dwellings, and I've questioned this a couple times, and I still question it, given what we know nationally from going to seeing what's happening all over the country, whether accepting the past as what the future is going to be like with multi-unit dwellings is an accurate way for us to be projecting. So that's one thing. And then when I think about that, I think about, well, I just want to bring it up now because it's in my head, is how do we reframe multifamily dwellings for this community? Because right now we have a whole bunch of discussions on various kinds of multifamily dwellings that people are not particularly, I mean, you've got some of Laurel Hill people are worried about in their area, you've got some in your area, we've had some of the, I mean, we have to think about how we frame what a good multifamily dwelling is and how that will work in our community, where it's been successful and why. And then, it's not liked. I think the tools are difficult, but if we have a good reason for using them and can show how they'll get us where we're going, I think when we try to use tools without tying it to what we're trying to, really tying it to what our goals are and what we're really trying to accomplish, we get into trouble. I like the idea of adding more, and actually I personally like the idea of us being pretty aspirational in what we're trying to do for our community, but tying it to our goals and values, and that's the trick for me. We are almost out of time. In fact, we're just about up to it. You have 3 people in the queue. We need to be as fast as we can, so please say what you need to say as fast as you can. Okay, Mike, and then Pat, and then George.
Thank you. Would you say that relative to other land need types, the single-family residential, the industrial, our multifamily land need is relatively low? Wouldn't you say that's accurate? We have a good supply within current UGB of multifamily developable lands?
I believe it depends on that redesignation issue.
Okay.
We're talking about potentially redesignating some multifamily lands to single-family lands. If we were to to redesignate all of that to single-family, that would increase our need by, I believe, 2,000 multifamily units.
But relatively speaking, to other types of land, we have a good supply, or less need than in other types, is all I'm getting to. It's for a future discussion at the other council meeting that I'm going to bring that up, just in case anybody. I wanted to get you here with the rest of it.
We'll defer that until later.
I'm not an expert in real estate. Yeah. Good. I'm not an expert in real estate values, but would you say improved, developed industrial land is of acre per acre higher value than improved, developed commercial land? Or would it be the other way around?
In terms of land values, I believe commercial lands have considerably higher value
Commercial
per
lands have
square foot.
considerably higher value than
Yes.
industrial land.
Yes.
Okay. I was trying to understand if our policy is going to be to convert some of our industrial lands to commercial. I was trying to calculate the impact on tax base. So if we're looking at that as a policy choice, we're actually, from the standpoint of the city, increasing the capacity of our tax base. We're making an intelligent choice because we're giving those lands at least the capacity for higher value. Now, the last question around what are the safe parameters around that growth percentage choice? How are we likely to be challenged in what body? If we were to say aspirationally, because after all, we're calling it Envision Eugene, we want to envision what the Eugene of tomorrow looks like and what kind of employment level we have. So let's say we wanted much higher levels of employment growth and we didn't want to stick to just that safe harbor number. And we wanted to pick a number. What are the parameters around which we have to pick that number so that it's safe from challenge, and who would challenge it?
Well, I believe that you cannot just be aspirational. We can't say because we want 30,000 jobs, we can use that as our growth forecast. Mm-hmm. We have to say, what are we going to do in order to get those jobs? What strategies, what tactics are we going to put in place to, as close as we can get to it, to guarantee that we will actually get those jobs? So there's a bit of a chicken and an egg issue in here because one of our strategies might be to increase our land need, but that can't be the only thing that we do. I think those that will be watching us such as Thousand Friends of Oregon, will be wanting to say, well, how Eugene, are you going to justify and back up that employment growth rate? Let's see, what are your strategies and tactics that you are actually putting in place to make that happen? And if we can do that, then we're probably fine. I'm not a lawyer, though.
Have we identified those sorts of things so far in the JEO strategy planning?
I think it's a good discussion for this group to have. We had a good discussion earlier with our technical resource group about that, and they feel strongly that this body needs to talk more about the JEO Economic Development Plan to say, what do we in Eugene want to put in place and actually develop kind of an implementation plan.
Do we have a
around
planned
that.
work session for that?
No.
Okay. Well, I'd like to request a poll then, I suppose. Okay.
All right, Pat, and then George, and then we need a change.
Thank you, Mayor. You make an excellent point, Mayor, regarding we all agree that we need multifamily lands inside the UGB, and whenever we find lands or designate lands, somehow we all have a reason to undesignate them or redesignate them into something different. So, and it happens all over town. Just a quick question on slide 15, which is multifamily housing. The numbers, the remaining multifamily need from 60-40 to 55-45, it's 0 to 1450, slides to 80 to 2070 units needed based on 60 versus 55 single family. So the difference between the two is 80 to 720, and we can assume then that that difference converts to single family dwellings if it's on the ratio.
It doesn't, excuse me, it doesn't convert 1-to-1 because the multifamily lands will have a much higher density assumption.
Or units.
But it's units.
Units per acre.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but okay. That's strictly on acreage and not based on actual need of units then. It's based on acreage available rather than unit need or projected population expansion or projected population growth.
Are you talking about the remaining need or the...
The need and not the capacity, the need. So we have multifamily need at 5720.
It's the next slide.
Which is...
this one here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm looking at what I have numbered 15. That one, yes. So the 5545 would give us a difference between 5720 and 6340. If that were, the difference in that is, if you look at the bottom line, it's 0 to 1450 versus 80 to 2070.
I see, yes, that's...
It's the need, not the available land.
That's right. I believe that's correct.
So the need then would be up to 720 single-family versus multifamily. I mean, it's the unit number is the same, whether it's multifamily or single-family.
That's correct. I understand what you're asking, yes. Yes, the difference in unit need for across the board on the top would be a shift from multifamily to single-family.
Up to 720 single-family units. Okay.
Yes.
Based on arithmetic.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you.
And
very clear.
To wrap it up, George?
All right,
And you get
very
divided by
quickly.
units.
I'd like to just go back to that
Different for single
list
family.
of
Which is-
capacity, the
so
list
that
of the incentives. That, I forget which number it is. That Councilor Pryor brought up, and I agree with him. Some of these have been very controversial. Some of them have been successful, and some of them have been... Failure would probably be too strong, but some of them haven't worked so well. Or some of them, like TIF, have worked well sometimes, but not so well other times. They've been like mixed. So I think we should, keep this list, even including urban renewal, but examine it again to get a little closer scrutiny. And yes, you're correct. That other cities, have different ways. And I've got some information at the conference in Phoenix, the National League of Cities, about Boulder's program.
Great.
And I have the information, and contact information and all that. But I think we ought to look at that because they've been much more modest with their inducements. Because companies want to go to Boulder, and I feel like there's probably a lot of companies that want to come here, but they don't give away the farm to get them here. And the new buzzword seems to be clawbacks. In other words, you reach an agreement with the company, and they do get incentives, they do get tax rebates, but not up front. They have to be there in your town for a year, meet the mutually agreed upon requirements, and then they get the rebate. And if they meet the next year's, keep following the goals, then they get another one and another one, up to 3 years. The grand totals are actually fairly modest. I mean, they even attracted a component of Siemens Company, which is a gigantic German company located in a small division, and I think their maximum inducement was something like $100,000. So, something we should look at. And also, as I mentioned in the budget subcommittee, the Human Services, Arizona a couple years ago passed an anti-corporate gifting law, which I want to learn more about, severely limiting the huge giveaways that communities were formerly used to employing to lure big employers. You can't do that anymore in Arizona, so I think we ought to look at those carefully. It could be instructive for us. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much, and we'll move on to the next item.
Thanks, Robin.
I want to welcome our police auditor, Mark Gisner, to the table.
That's a tough act to follow.
Congratulations, Jerry. Do you still have to be confirmed? Yeah, one or the other, right? Sure.
When you say confirmed, I think of, confirmation. So you're in with the bishop, are you?
My name's Mike, I'll be your waiter tonight.
Thank you, Mike.
Nice job.
Thank you very much. Don't forget to tip your waitresses.
He's here through the rest of the week?
Yes.
All right, we're ready to go when you are.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. As you know, I'm asked to, you betcha, I'm asked to come here about 3 times a year to talk about things that are going on in our office. That's, I guess, a little less exciting since we have a newsletter now that Leah produces on a weekly basis, and I think that really tries to capture as much information as we can push out without violating the public records laws and all those fun things that are confusing sometimes in Oregon. And so I think that it's been helpful. We haven't made everyone happy at times when we've done this, but I think it's important to get the message out to the community and anybody else who's interested in what we're doing. I'm just going to kind of talk about where we are progress-wise in 2011, because I think there's some interesting things, and I get this right. We're tracking at about 20% increase in complaints this year compared to previous years. We had a pretty good surge from February and into the summertime. All sorts of things, really, in terms of complaints that we get. It's somewhat different and unusual from my experience, and there's a graph of it. Anecdotally, the driving complaints are way down. I think that officers are sensitive to citizens' concerns about the way they drive, and so those are way down. Courtesy and force complaints are down. One phenomena that's interesting to me is we're getting far less complaints involving that sort of 2 to 3 o'clock window when the bars downtown close. So I don't know if there's...
The Bermudas?
Yes, there and over on 6th Street. Just far less kind of complaints from those activities, and I'm not sure the message that we got out this year on Party Patrol, because I've talked about it for a couple of years now, but I think the message is out there to just, if the police come, turn the music down, get rid of the 19-year-olds, close the doors and windows so you're not disturbing your neighbors, and it seems to be working out pretty well. I think another phenomena, quite frankly, is the jail beds issues, because as I've discussed with others, they have to be more creative in their problem-solving skills on the streets now, because there's no place to take folks. And so I think there's, by default, more communication going on the streets. I think the real bad guys are still going to jails, but those folks who are disruptive, disorderly, maybe have a little bit too much to drink, there seems to be more communication going on, and so I think that that's had an impact on our complaints. Now, what we've got so far in terms of our allegations are up. We've had a few criminal allegations, and as we've said in the past, those are referred to the, if it's like something to do with missing property, it's usually done within the criminal investigation section. If it's something more substantive, it's done through the Oregon State Patrol. And service complaints are about the same. Policy complaints are up a little bit. One of the things that it's always interesting that sometimes on these complaints, we're getting a lot of complaints from folks because the police don't respond in a timely manner on barking dog issues, of all things. And I wrote 3 different letters today about barking dogs. And that really irritates a person when the dog next door is barking. But in terms of priorities, it's difficult for officers to prioritize that sort of thing. When they think that, when a sergeant who does that type of service complaint thinks that the person might elevate that their displeasure with the neighbor's barking dog, then they'll try to assign someone to it. But that's kind of been a new phenomena for us. We've had, particularly from parents who have students who attend the University of Oregon, and they're not from here, the response time on burglaries or alleged burglaries, or someone's playing with a doorknob and I don't understand why did it take 12 hours for the police to come out there, kind of thing. I think that the response time here in Eugene is different than for where those folks live. And I know one we had where I think it was about 12 or 14 hours before someone came out on a burglary, and the bad people were gone already. It was during one of the Occupy Eugene events, and so all the officers were dedicated to the Occupy issue. But it's difficult to explain that issue to people because there are surges in activities at times, and how the calls are prioritized. So that's a little bit of a concern. Well, actually, it's not a little bit. It's a big concern. And I've talked to the chief about it and how we can go about doing that. I think that burglary is one of those the home crime ones. I know there's burglaries for businesses. We call them breaking and enterings in Ohio, and we called a burglary, aggravated burglary, when you went into someone's home. Obviously very disconcerting for people, and they want a response, and especially when it involves their 19-year-old daughter and they live in California and they just can't figure out why it's taken 6 or 8 or 12 hours before an officer gets out there to take a report. So I think that is something that we should all be concerned about. And generally speaking, just the response time issue in general is a matter of concern for folks, and we try to deal with those. We've had more complaints that are internally generated. I think we're seeing supervisors recognize when people commit performance errors or use poor judgment and I think that that's a good thing, that they're recognizing those things and bringing them forward. And we've had to focus some attention on the communications section as well. We also have oversight authority over the non-sworn personnel, and so again, there's always a lot of job openings in the communications section, and there's folks that work an awful lot of overtime and have to deal with a lot of calls. So we've had some performance issues there that we're dealing with, and I think we're dealing with them well. In terms of our dispositions of allegations, now this was through October. We've actually closed a number of cases, and so you'll see the orange bar, which represents 2011 and is through October 31st, is all those decisions are for the most part down, but I think that those will pretty much balance out by the end of the year, because we had a lot in the queue when we did these slides, and those are coming to fruition. Another phenomenon that we're going to have to deal with here is one of the sergeants in internal investigations will be going back to patrol, and then another sergeant, I'm not sure when she'll go back to doing something else. So we have to go through that sort of transition. I don't necessarily like to use the word retraining because it makes it think like they don't have investigative skills, but this is a skill set that's different than what they've normally done. So bringing folks up to speed on what our expectations are and what the CRB expectations are. There's always a bit of a learning curve there. So I always admire the folks that volunteer for this, but I also think that leadership in a policing organization needs folks who have had this exposure in internal affairs or around the internal affairs environment. It's a different kind of exposure. So let's see, we're on one of the things I think that's been talked about briefly, I want to talk about a little bit more, is when we dismiss cases, we get written up for that. And I just wanted to outline of the 16 dismissed cases that we've had, 3 outside jurisdiction. In fact, Mayor knows we've just dealt with one today that was Oregon State Patrol. One was an alternative remedy, which means a person says that they're not guilty of I think it was a traffic ticket, and that's for the judge to decide, not for us to decide. 2 other highly unlikely occurred. If I remember correctly, one person was alleging that the police were sending high-frequency radio waves into his wristwatch and causing problems for him. So clearly not something that was worthy of investigation, but certainly required some services that we couldn't provide. One person recanted on a criminal investigation, later indicating to the Oregon State Patrol investigator that it was possible that her thinking process was altered by mushrooms that she purchased at a local festival. So that was the one that recanted. One was previously investigated twice, I think, once in 1994 and once in about 2001 and 2002. So even though we had paperwork on that and a fairly thick report, that's how that ended up dismissed. And then we had 8 timeliness, and you can see the dates from those timeliness. The 2011 one was every now and again the taser discharges when someone's handling it, and this one struck the floor. We're sort of going through a debate right now about whether there should be a what they call a blue folder, an investigation when there's an accidental taser just discharge that strikes another employee. So we're kind of having a discussion about that. I think that it's a safety-related issue and that it should be looked at from an investigative standpoint and to determine whether it was equipment failure or the person wasn't careful enough. But I certainly take safety issues very seriously, so we're having that discussion. But I just wanted to, again, highlight that the dismissed cases are all looked at very carefully, and we make decisions based on what the ordinance requires and whether or not there is cause to continue with an investigation. In terms of sustained allegations, we're about, I think last year for total, we had less than 59. I forget what the number is right now, but our sustained rate so far, again, is about 25%, and that includes internally generated complaints. And again, when you compare us nationwide, I think we've been vigilant about trying to identify performance issues, and I'm still not sure that there's anybody that's around the 26% rate. I'm sure there must be somebody out there. I just haven't found them yet, and I look really hard. So I think, again, it's a tribute to the process. In addition, I really appreciate, and I'm sure the police appreciates, that the mechanisms are resourced well, so that instead of these cases taking 3 and 4 years, and there's at least one city up there where it takes 3 or 4 years, that we're getting these things turned over in a rapid fashion and getting folks answers to the questions that they have. And again, I still think our de facto mediation program, in which sergeants are interacting with complainants on the service complaints, except for a few folks, I think that those interactions are going very, very well, and I appreciate the training that the sergeants are getting in terms of those communication skills. Some of the other things that we're having fun with, the weekly newsletter. I'm not aware of any other agency that does it. There's probably one out there somewhere that does it. But I think we do provide good information to the community. We really had a lot of input on a short-term basis on the search and seizure policy. For some folks, perhaps our input didn't go over that well, but it's one of those, John calls them pillars. I don't have 7 pillars in terms of police complaints. I have about 5. And search and seizure policy is one of those pillars where we have high expectations that our officers are going to understand, and ours, I mean the City of Eugene's, are going to understand what those policies are in detail, and also use that as a reference point whenever after they've come home from work and think, I wonder if I did things the right way, can look at that. So that's one of the things that's really important for us, and I think that what the Police Commission is recommending to the chief is going to be one of the best models of a search and seizure policy in the nation. So we're real proud of that work that we did. We have regular civilian review board meetings with important topics and training. I try to give them cases where it's a tough call for us, and we really value their input on some of those tough calls. We've gone on some field trips, if you will. Last time we went to the Buckley House, which was kind of a surprise for all of us, because they indicated that they had 18 beds, but it was pretty unusual for them to have a full house. And so it kind of makes me wonder sometimes where we fall in terms of services and how those work out. And it's clearly, at least for me, an underutilized facility. But I don't know, since it is voluntary for folks, how they feel about going into that kind of environment. It seems like a very helpful and, quite frankly, nurturing environment, but you have to choose to go there, I suppose. The other issues surrounding the ordinance, I sent to council what we defined for the purposes of our policies and procedures for good cause. I didn't feel at the time that it was necessary to put that in the ordinance. Sometimes I think we have too much in the ordinance already as opposed to policies and procedures, but I think that that was helpful for the review board as well. I continue to sit on the University of Oregon Police Complaint Resolution Working Group. We had another meeting today. I think they're going to deliver their report to the president or an interim president. I don't know what the news is today. So, and I think that that's going to cause a bit of a disconnect for our process. I just wanted to go through it real quick. They're just going to have a review board that's going to be complaint-based, and they'll meet about 4 times a year. It'll be staffed by the Department of Public Service or their police department. I don't know what their name of their agency will be. I think it'll be in place soon. My understanding of how these agencies work is rarely will they get complaints from students. I think they recognize that their role with the students is different than their role with non-students. They build a committee that will be recommended to the president, but is very representative of the university. I'm not so sure it's representative of the community at large. And the reason I say that is because 85% of their current contacts are non-students. So you have a committee that's going to be reviewing complaints that is going to be almost entirely staffed, if you will, by students, faculty, and administrative personnel of the university. But in fact, 85% of their current contacts are non-students, and I expect that that's going to continue. It's also likely, I think, that they'll be making non-campus arrests. I would hope that they would assist on the party patrol kind of things. Sworn police officers in the state of Oregon have police powers in the entire state, so they are certainly within their power to not be on campus and make arrests, unlike some states. If there's mutual aid and a contact, how will oversight handle? I'm not real sure. I think, and these are my opinions, I think they'll have a pretty high turnover on the committee, and I think because of that high turnover, there'll probably be a lack of some training and experience. As I indicated, probably very few student complaints. Most of the complaints are going to continue to come from the community, but they're going to be intake points within the university for folks in the community to complain, and they're going to have several intake points, which I think is going to be a training issue as well. And we'll see what happens and once how they respond and maintain confidence after a major incident. Hopefully they won't have one, but I suspect at some point they will, and that'll really define the dynamic of that organization. The last slide was, and it's impossible to read from this angle, of course, is how their complaint process was going to work. It had far fewer boxes, and still we started working with them on how the whole process is going to work. I don't think there'll be much oversight of the investigations internally, like we have with the auditor's office, and we'll see how that goes. And they're also going to have advocates for the students who might file a complaint against the Department of Public Service, but they're not going to have advocates for non-students. So, again, it'll be an interesting dynamic. I know the current president indicated that sort of the phase-in for all this stuff would be more than a year, less than 6 years, and we'll see how that works out. But I think that they have a long way to go with that, and so I'll conclude with that because I suspect you'll probably have questions about it.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say, first of all, how much I appreciate the newsletter. I read it, and I share it with people all the time, and I think it really helps people understand better what's happening with your office, and I think it's important for people to know. I wanted to say your comments about the 9/11 folks, and if I hadn't gone to that civilian police academy, I would not have guessed the amount of training people in that have to have. I would never have guessed how extensively they have to know so many things and the kind of pressure they're under to respond appropriately to the gazillion kinds of things that come in. We get a lot of things about they seem too gruff or they seem to not be interested or care, but they go through a terrific amount of training to be able to try to help people and take it very, very seriously. And then the other thing that I found interesting in terms of your internal, the sergeant who does the internal investigations going back to patrol, just an observation that I think he stated is it's not usually their favorite job to be having to investigate their fellow officers. So it feels they think it's important, but they're happy to not be having that burden any longer when they move back to, and they can take what they learned back with their other officers. So that helps with the whole, everybody can understand how everything works, so that's good. I would just close by saying I am and have been and continue to be concerned about how the campus police department is going to work out. My biggest concern has been from the beginning about that role that you play, that oversight of investigations, that place for people to go when they're concerned about how they're being dealt with, and that there's no independent body that they have access to look at what happens. So that remains a real concern, because I understand the difference between the university and the city, but I also know they're dealing with the people of our community, and that's a grave concern to me. I expressed it. I think they know it, but I'm hoping that we'll find a way to thread that needle. But it is big to me. All right, Andrea, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. So I just wanted to clarify for the listening folks. You made a comment about going to Buckley House and there was empty beds. So there's, multiple parts to Buckley House. There's the inpatient detox, and then there's a sobering station. And I know that the inpatient detox beds, there are some of them that are held open for vets. They're already paid for, whether people are there or not. And I think if you saw a lack of bodies in there. And the other thing is, for people to get into Buckley House, into the detox center, they have to have insurance. So if you're truly indigent, you can't go in there. You can go to the detox center, but then they try and find you ways to finance that other piece of it. I know they're trying to look at having a nurse there to provide medical detox, so that they can, if somebody has a doctor's order for medical detox, then they can get that paid for by the state. But we're going to be discussing that as budget times come up, and I don't want people to have that impression. So I also want to thank you for the newsletter. I think it's very informative, and I enjoy reading it, and I share it also with my communities. And I also share the mayor's concern about the campus police, and I just, or public safety, I see them zipping around that area there down by campus and around Sacred Heart Medical Center, and it just kind of always, it's like it always takes me back, because they're so police-looking like, and you can't really tell that they're not EPD officers, and so I'm always kind of concerned about that. And I just wondered if you could help me on your slide that had some of the complaints that there was from other outside jurisdictions. Can you explain to me a little bit on if there is a multi-jurisdiction complaint, say a crime happens in Springfield and people end up getting arrested over here, or how that by our officers because they live here, or whatever the scenario is, and then there's a complaint that comes from it. How does that proceed from there?
If it's a complaint about the person being taken in custody by a Eugene police officer, then we would handle that.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a complaint about how Springfield conducted an investigation to determine that this person should be arrested, then that would be something under Springfield's jurisdiction.
Okay. So is our SWAT team still multi-jurisdictional, or does Eugene still have their own? I've forgotten.
Eugene is the primary agency for SWAT, so oftentimes Eugene personnel will be the primary folks on a SWAT operation, even though it's outside the city limits of Eugene. If there's a complaint generated as a result of that, then it would stay within our jurisdiction and the Eugene Police Department jurisdiction in terms of the administrative investigation.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to know, just a couple anecdotal things. So are, the Human Rights Commission and I think the Police Commissioner are going to be embarking on a hate crimes conference, and I'm wondering if the CRB is going to be a part of that. I would hope they would be, and I would hope that you would be a part of it with your vast knowledge and contacts in the community.
We've had some brief discussions about that, trying to stay on that neutral path and still get involved in, I prefer to call it a hate crimes prevention conference as opposed to a hate crimes conference. But I suspect that at some point in time that there'll be some involvement there. It's just trying to find that where it's all now. I think it's still pretty much at the genesis stage. So I think that we do have folks who will be interested in participating.
Great. Well, that's great. It probably should be called Anti-Hate Crimes Conference. But there you go. Anyway, thank you. Good to see you, Mark.
Thanks.
Pat.
Thank you, Mayor. Mark, I'm going to skip a bunch of the charts that you gave because I believe that we're in pretty good hands with the way you're reporting and the way you're investigating issues. Yeah. But I'm going to skip straight to the mayor's concern, which Councilor Ortiz echoed a little bit. When I first came to Eugene in 1973, I got a letter from the mayor of Eugene, and I still have the letter.
Wow.
It made that much of an impression on me. And the mayor's concern was how the campus police and the city police are going to interact with one another. And on slide 11, you list remaining items of interest, which are each one is a potential point that we could end up devoting a great deal of council time to. And just not to hash through each of these points, but it's important that for me personally to know that when we're talking about the campus police receiving more authority, more arrest capability, and we seem to approve that unanimously as a council. I seem to, not unanimously, but we passed it through, perhaps without looking at all of the ramifications of the interaction between city and campus police. And you point out some things regarding off-campus arrests and a sworn officer having jurisdiction throughout the entire state. And you also look at foresee high turnover, potentially lack of training. And I think, Mayor, that perhaps these points that are raised here, at some point in the not-too-distant future, we should take a look at those as a council and see if we can be better prepared for when those do begin to surface as actual, not just items of interest, but items of concern as we begin to see the items of interest manifest themselves. Each one of these is, are areas that I personally didn't consider too greatly when I was thinking about campus police having more authority in patrolling campus.
Yeah.
Please.
No, I was going to say, especially...
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry. You are the mayor. But Mayor, Les Anderson sent me that letter, and it was a wonderful letter, and I believe that your action as the mayor has a great deal of impact on students, and I know that you take that very seriously.
Thank you.
And I want to make it clear, it's not necessarily about the campus police, but it's about the oversight process.
Right.
My expectation, and I'm certain the expectation of the senior leadership of the University of Oregon, is that they hire highly competent police officers, they get the DPSST training that they're not getting right now because they're not sworn officers. So that is our hope. But as Andrea wanted to point out, the vast majority of their contacts are non-students. And I don't think that that is reflected in the current composition of their oversight structure.
And that does lead me to the other point, to the flow chart that you provided to us regarding the proposed complaint resolution. If 85% of the contact is with non-campus or non-students, then potentially 85% of the complaints are going to come from non-student sources. And I noticed that everything, once again, falls down on a single pivot point on the flow chart, and that is the internal investigation by Professional Standards Office, findings submitted to the U of O Chief of Police. So everything flows to the U of O Chief of Police, certainly through other checkpoints, but it all ends up with the U of O Chief of Police. And if 85% of those cases are, well, there's my point. Thank you, Mayor.
So the only thing I want to just follow up with very, very briefly is just to say I am not at all criticizing their police department or thinking they're not going to be professionally trained just like any police department. That is not my concern. My concern is where our responsibility ends and theirs begins, and how we ensure people get their rights taken care of. So that's just my concern. Alan, you're next, and then George Brown.
Thanks, Mark. As usual, I think you're doing a very good job, a great job, and that the police auditor's office is in good hands with you at the helm. I'm very glad you're involved in the U of O police auditor office development and the procedures and policies. I supported the U of O police department becoming a police department, but still remain concerned, as other people do, about how that all is going to work out. The devil's in the details, and there's a lot of details we don't know. Exactly how much training they're going to get, what kind of new hires they're going to get, are they going to have weapons, how are they going to react, what's their budget going to be, all these kind of things and then on top of that, one of the things that Pat brought up, 85% of the contacts are non-student contacts. That means they're dealing with Eugene and Springfield residents, I suspect. I'm kind of wondering how many of those are sports event related. Do you have any idea?
I don't think it's. Well, I don't know. They have one of the highest expulsion rates from sporting events in the nation at their football games, so they usually outnumber the entire Big Ten over the course of a season. So I don't know if it's because they're more vigilant about getting rid of folks, or if they just have a lot of number of disruptive folks. But I think a lot of them. Let's face facts. It's a safe place to be. If you're outdoors, if you're transient, homeless, it's probably one of the safest places in the city to be in that situation. So there's a lot of folks. They're also easy targets for their bikes and their computers and their backpacks and their laptops, and so if you're a person who is employed in the criminal enterprise business, then that's also an easy target. And then all the buildings are open. It's a magnet for all sorts of people for all kinds of reasons, and so I think that's the primary reason that 85% of their contacts are non-students. It's a place to hang out, whatever your motive might be.
Yeah, I'm glad to see you're involved in the police auditor function. The one thing you brought up is the turnover issue. I look at the makeup of it, and 3 students and faculty and I'm kind of wondering how stable it's going to be. I know I know that in our CRB it takes people quite a long time to get up to speed and be effective in being a participant in the CRB, and how do you think that's going to work out in the U of O program? It's not going to be the same as ours, which obviously, but
I can only go by what I've seen at other campuses like University of Michigan. University of Michigan police get like 20 complaints a year. They've had positions that have been vacant on their review board for months, if not years. I think that the training, getting up to speed and learning things in the training thing is going to be difficult, and just probably when you get to that point, then you're going to have students graduate or move on, things like that. So I think that's going to be more of a problem than they might think it's going to be. I also think that having multiple intake portals is going to be problematic, because we probably spend, Leah's gone, we probably spend about 10% of our work hours as counselors for folks who just don't understand the things that go on in everyday life, don't understand the court system, are suffering from substance abuse, or suffering from diminished mental capacity at the time. We spend hours upon hours just who might have an interaction with the police, might have had an interaction with the police in 1994, as if it still happened the next day. But at least we're used to that, and we're used to that intake point, and I'm not sure that there's yet that recognition that from an intake standpoint, I mean, we had a guy who had his shower curtain stolen like 10 years ago, and in his mind sometimes it's still as if it happened yesterday, and he's not real happy about it still. And so, I think about 10% of our time is counseling-based kind of services.
I hope you got a new shower curtain. So one of the other things in here is that DRO on non-PD would have non-campus arrests. One of the things that I wanted to see happen, talking with the chief, is the area surrounding the university obviously has a lot of party patrols and the noise and from youth parties, and having the ability of the campus police, once they're trained and sworn officers and things like that, be able to go off campus in that limited area and deal with a lot of those issues will take a heck of a lot of pressure off EPD and make our police force that much more effective if we can take some of those types of complaints, we're not talking about murders and burglaries and things like that necessarily, but other kinds of complaints that they can deal with more effectively. It will really help us. On your slides, can you give us an example of service complaints versus policy complaints?
Well, a lot of the service complaints we've gotten lately is, again, officers not responding on a barking dog case, or someone gets their bike stolen, and when they call, an officer doesn't come out. It's a telephone. It's not unusual for police agencies to have telephone crime reporting kinds of issues. Discourtesy, if they think that the officer wasn't courteous at the time. If someone is stopped for we had one stopped for a bicycle violation, just ran a red light at like 8 o'clock at night, and lived to tell about it, but was patted down during that point in time, not searched. But those kinds of things are again, it's mostly it's either a customer service issue with how the officers deal with them, but again, those have diminished significantly. I think there's a lot of good communication that's going on, and again, the real bad guys are the ones that are going to jail, but most everybody else they've got to deal with and talk to. But I would say, well, it used to even be the driving cases, but mostly the response time and why you didn't come out and take a report versus taking a report over the telephone, or why you didn't call me back about this crime that occurred. That's what mostly they're involving right now.
Yeah. On the next slide, you had unfounded within policy. You said there's a lot of pending that might flesh this out, but those two seem way under what we experienced the last 2 years.
For the moment, yeah, I think that's going to change. I think the number of allegations I think last year there were a number of decisions made within one complaint, and I think that number's down now. I think we're not having multiple elements to a complaint. We're not having multiple officers typically in a complaint, because they've been better about resolving situations as a group. So again, not having that jail bed thing going on, not having the party patrol going on, because sometimes with the party patrol you have 5, 6, 7 officers that end up there, and so that pads the stats, if you will. But I think at the end of the year, I think most everything's going to push up about where those lines are.
That's the stats.
Yeah.
So the last one is the timeliness. Some of these are really old.
Those are the ones that we dismiss, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
they stay in the system that long. 2094, 2001, 2005.
Well, again, sometimes they come in and it's as if it happened the day before.
Oh, so they're making them now.
Yes, from incidents that occurred way back.
1989?
Yeah.
Okay, we have George Brown next in the line.
Yeah. And they're still unhappy.
Thank you. Well, I would just want to add that I also appreciate the newsletter that you and Leah, your assistant Leah Pitcher put out. I like to read the yearly report, but it's also nice to have a more frequent, take it in little chunks, and then look at the yearly report at the end of the year. I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate your and Leah's constructive inputs on the Eugene Police Department search and seizure policy. I think you added a lot of significant points that might have been missed by the Police Commission. That's really one of the key policies in that that's where a lot of the complaints generate from, is that policy, and it's really good to have that nailed down and a little tighter so that everyone can clearly understand what's allowable and what's not. That was good. And I think we're all a little bit concerned about the university police department of the oversight. I'm not so much concerned about doing it as just because of the inexperience. And I was looking at the flow chart too, to kind of mirroring one of Councilor Farr's concerns. It seems like everything flows through the professional standards office, and I realize this is just a draft. This is not set in stone, and there may be some changes. But then I see over here, let's say criminal allegations it says may be forwarded for external investigation by either Eugene Police Department or Oregon State Police. I guess those would be ones that aren't dismissed for improbability or unlikeliness. And then to the DA, and then back to the Professional Standards Office. I don't know. I know when you're starting from new, and then they're going to have their own internal. Basically, they have their own internal affairs.
Yes, that's their office.
To do.
That's their Office of Professional Standards.
A while to get the experience to know how to do that, I suppose. Do they do that already?
The
equivalent of that now?
The current person in there used to work for the FBI. I don't know how much of that involved sort of administrative investigations kinds of processes, but I think they'll eventually have one or two persons in internal affairs depending on how many complaints they get.
Yeah, they'll just have to get the experience, I guess, as time goes. Okay, thank you.
Mike?
Oh, thank you, Mayor, and his multitude of questions. Alan covered the question that I had exceptionally well. But I will say, as always, that I appreciate your efforts and your office's efforts, everybody there. I most especially appreciate your going above and beyond in the communication realm of keeping us informed as you go with things that are happening. I've seen that as a very valuable improvement to the office, and I appreciate your extra efforts.
But I don't want to. There's a couple things that have gone on here recently that are going to be dealt with. I mean, not everything's rosy. There's a couple significant problems that I've explained already to Betty and George in our monthly meetings and the mayor. So, there's still work that needs to be done, and we're going to get it done. And again, the pushback from the department occurs infrequently, and we all seem to want to try to get the best performance we can for our citizens. And I think in again, a lot of ways, things are better than when I got here, and we're going to continue to try to get better.
Thank you. I guess since I'm sure that there will be some interest in the conversation we've had about campus police department, the discussion tonight, I'm sure there will be some interest around the community about that. I just want to reiterate that I do believe, at least the vast majority of us feel, that will give us additional officers to help in our community. So we see it as a positive plus for trying to deal with law enforcement issues in the community. We just want to be sure it's done in a way that is really careful about the rights and needs of people of our community, that's all. So I just don't want to set off any alarms that don't need to be set off, but I think it's fair for this, and I will follow up with Pat's request for us to have a council meeting to have some discussion around some of these, because I think, it'd be good for us to pass on our concerns. Thank you very much, and I think that will do it for tonight.
Thank you.
You want to do the consent agenda?
Yeah, we could do the consent calendar. You want to do that?
Yeah.
Before I put the hammer down?
Before you put the hammer down, let's take care of the consent agenda.
All right, so, you check? Okay. Is she coming back in, or she's, no?
Just continue.
Okay, so why don't we, George, you want to put a motion out on the consent calendar?
I move to approve the items on the consent calendar.
I'll second the motion.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor, please indicate.
Aye.
Aye. 1, 2, 3, 7 in favor and none in opposition. Passes. Thank you. And then we'll be back together at 7:30. Any favors?
Good job, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.